gentlemen, welcome to the future. My name is Zach Gardner. I'm the chief architect at Keyhole Software. And because this is 2024, we can't go a day without talking about generative AI. I wanted to expose my brain to many different points of view. I wanted to talk to people in healthcare and finance, in every vertical that I could think of, but there was one vertical that was lacking, and that was someone that could really give me some insights from a legal perspective. Now, I am not a lawyer by any means. I didn't even take the LSAT. I have absolutely no desire to. So, thankfully, for all of us today, I found someone that could talk to me about what are some of the implications of generative AI from a legal standpoint. What are some of the things that people, both outside of the law and inside of the law, should be thinking about? And today, with me from Idaho, correct?
Correct.
Mm, that's good. We talked like 3 months ago to schedule this, and I'm that for some reason that's stuck in my head. Vern Eastley is the legal AI advisor at Vern Eastley Advisors. How's it going, Vern? Long time to talk.
It's going great. Happy to talk to you today. Thanks for having me on.
Anytime, anytime. So my disclaimer that everyone that listens to the show knows and loves, if they had a drinking game, I'm sure they would have to chug while I say it. So I'm going to go extra slow this time. All the views and opinions expressed in this program are the views and opinions of the participants and do not reflect their employers or their trade organizations. It's just two dudes. We're just talking, just having a good time. So to get us started off with, maybe introduce yourself. Like what's your background? How did you get into, legal AI advisor? There's got to be a good story behind that.
Yeah, well, your little disclaimer was a great little legal intro, so there must be a little bit of a lawyer gene in there somewhere. I should start off by saying, just like you, I never took the LSAT. I never went to law school, so it is a bit of a strange place I found myself in. I'm actually a software engineer by background, and I've run a mobile app development agency for a long time. But about a year ago, a little over a year ago, I got really heavily into using AI in my work. And so the topic was obviously on my mind. But then one day I had lunch with a buddy who runs a consulting firm as a law librarian, and he's constantly getting inquiries from law firms about AI. They're kind of a mix between freaking out about it and being excited about it. So we talked for like 2 hours about how AI is affecting law. I just couldn't get this out of my mind. I thought this is the perfect place to combine AI with some other industry. So as a complete legal neophyte, other than perhaps negotiating some contracts with my own attorney over the years, I just jumped head first into this in about August of 2023, and I've been drinking from the fire hose ever since.
Very cool. Very cool. That's good to know. And yeah, that's how we bond. It was mobile app. Of course I
Mobile
remember.
apps.
So for those of us that are not in the legal field, I spend most of my day in healthcare IT. I have some, sort of periphery knowledge, but I definitely haven't been thinking about it as much as someone like you. What are some of the things that an application architect or a application developer should be thinking about in terms of our usage of generative AI? Just kind of give me the lowdown as a I don't know if a dilettante is the right word, but a
Hmm.
part of the laity. Let's say it like that.
Yeah. Well, I think my first response would be there's always a class of problems as software engineers that we wish we could solve, but we're just not that smart. Like some things are really hard to boil down to an algorithm that you can express in code, especially if you're dealing with natural language or if you're dealing with like nuanced understanding of complicated issues. If it's hard to build an algorithm to express it, AI is a really great candidate, especially this generative AI that's all the rage these days. So I've found as a software engineer, there are a lot of examples of things where I don't know how to do it with conventional programming, but I could think of all sorts of ways that I could tackle the problem using AI. Now, whether I'm going to make a mistake and screw something up with that is also, an important question to ask. But at least there are things we can try now where we have capabilities within our grasp that used to not be there. Let me just give you an example. You mentioned healthcare. I've worked with a client outside the legal field, of course, who is, I guess I can't get into too much detail on this yet, but I've worked with a client that's involved with medical transcription and
Mhm.
figuring out things like billing codes based on a really detailed note left by a doctor. There are firms out there already that can take a transcribed note from a physician and they can figure out what the ICD-10 codes are for Medicaid billing or whatever it is, just based on that. And it's not something where you can just do a keyword search. It requires identifying actual concepts and ideas from a conversation. And so that kind of thing is now within our grasp. And there are lots of things in every industry where problems that used to be pretty much impossible are now at least something we could look into.
Mhm. Now, I came across two examples of that already this week. One of them, I knew kind of what I was after. I wanted to be able to do managed identity authentication to be able to access a key vault on Azure. I was like, I know I've done this before.
Mhm.
Just for the life of me, I can't remember what it is that I did, but I was able to, ask ChatGPT. I was like, all right, pretend you're an expert C# programmer, which I should be with this many years. This is the problem that I'm trying to solve. What are some of the ways you would solve it? And so it gave me like two or three, and then like the first two, I was like, that's not going to work. The third one, I was like, yes, that is exactly what I was thinking about. But it didn't require me to like copy any code, so to speak. It was like, this is the class name I was after. Then I was able to go out and like Google and then figure some additional things out from that. So there really isn't any attribution. I don't think that I would have to give ChatGPT. I don't think its feelings are going to be hurt, by any means. But that is one of the things I was curious about, as a developer, like how do we ensure that we're giving like proper attribution? Is that even like, does it even matter? Because it's not, it itself is not a entity that is going to come after me, if I copy one line of code from it, or do I have to, attribute to it because it wasn't something that I directly wrote? I don't know. These are some of the things that I think about.
Yeah, it's a really great question. I mean, I'm one of those weird programmers who will put attribution into a source comment if I find something like on a website where it explains,
Mhm.
here's how you do this thing. I do it for my own benefit as much as anything, but programmers coming after me could benefit from seeing what guided my thinking. And you can't just provide a link to ChatGPT. I suppose you could put the prompt in, but the model's changing
Yeah.
continually. There's randomness and variation in the answer by design. So you can't exactly duplicate the answer. I suppose you could paste it in. But it's interesting. There's one other thing I want to touch on in your story there.
Mhm.
Um, the issue of, oh, geez, just having a little brain cramp here. My mind just totally blanked. It's like the time I was in my piano recital a few months ago and I forgot the song. Oh, I hope we can edit for a moment here.
Yeah, no. And actually, I forgot the second
Shoot.
example. I wanted to do some regression analysis in Python. And like I haven't done like a ton of Python, but I can at least read it. I know what's going on, but it's harder for me to write it. And there were a couple different algorithms, a couple different machine learning models that I could have used. So instead of me going out and Googling, like, what are the advantages? What are the disadvantages of one model over another? I just gave it the list of models and I was like, what are the differences between all of these? So it saved me a bunch of time. And even if it made me 1, 2, 3, 4% more effective, like
Hmm.
if you're talking about like a professional athlete, if they have the ability to get 2% more effective, I mean, that's the difference between winning a championship and not. So I
Yeah.
really do see this tool as something that even if it helps just on the margins, that alone might be worth it.
Well, that's interesting because that's exactly the point I was hoping to get to. There are lots of studies out there that claim that generative AI is more helpful for neophytes and newbies than it is for experts. And the reason they're making that claim is they're saying someone who has no idea how to tackle a problem can ask a question and then get some guidance and start making some traction really fast. But I think that's actually not the best way to look at it because in your case as more of an expert where you don't need someone to tell you how to do this thing exactly, you just need to know which of the various paths I could follow to do this Azure authentication thing or whatever it is. Like what I know the theory, I just need to know how to get there. And I find that when experts like attorneys or software engineers, for example, are using ChatGPT and other systems, They already have all the intellectual framework. They have the background. They just need to know, okay, what's the quickest way from point A to point B? I already know where I'm going. Whereas with a newbie, you don't really understand the lay of the land and you're just kind of typing things in like a monkey. You don't really know what you're doing. So it creates the illusion of progress, but I don't think it's quite the same. But for you or I working on something that we already understand, it can help us avoid a lot of wandering around in the wilderness, so to speak, and just converge very quickly on the thing that we would have eventually found Googling, but we can find it in 30 seconds instead of an hour. So I actually
Mhm.
think AI helps experts more than it helps newbies.
And we don't have to scroll through, accept my cookie policy.
Oh
We don't
my
have to
gosh.
scroll through, here's my life story about when I studied abroad. And it's like, no, I just want to look at
I
this
just want the
class. Like,
answer.
just, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
no. So
it's
you,
brilliant for that.
you touched on it right on the end of, if you're an expert, programmer, this can help you. But if you're an expert in the legal field, what are some of the things that these type of people should be looking at? How are they able to use generative AI maybe to optimize their workflows? And maybe what are some of the things that they should be avoiding as they get into this?
Right. Yeah, there's actually a lot of low-hanging fruit there in the legal field because the best lawyers and the worst lawyers, every lawyer has to deal with a bunch of long, boring documents where they're combing through looking for nuances, complexities, contradictions, little points. There's so many use cases where like I just did a seminar for a legal team in-house at a company just a few hours ago. One of the use cases that came up for them is that they get white papers from the marketing department. They get other marketing materials, and everything has to be reviewed by legal before it goes out in order to find and nip in the bud any potential liability situations. So some poor soul has to study the 100-page white paper that gets cranked out every month. That still has to be done manually, no matter, I would never trust AI completely to do that. But using just a few prompts and some examples from past reviews about the kinds of things that have been found and fixed, it's very easy in a matter of minutes to get a nice punch list of the areas to pay the most attention to and the types of problems that are likely to surface in this example. So instead of spending the entire afternoon studying this document, a lawyer can 3 minutes in know right where to apply his or her attention most closely in order to vet the top 80, 90% of problems. Um, Another corollary to this is often what you need is not the perfect answer next week, but a really good answer today. So the combination of a good attorney using these tools can get you a pretty good solid answer about the general level of quality, for example, in an agreement almost immediately instead of whenever you work through it in the list. So there are plenty of other examples, but I think that's a good specific one to throw out to begin with.
Mhm. That's good. And there was a story I was thinking about too. I think I heard about it back in like November. There was a attorney in Florida, I believe he was an eviction attorney, and he had submitted a brief to the judge, and the judge was looking through the brief, and it was like, these cases that you're referencing to support your claim, they don't sound familiar. So he called the attorney into his office. He was like, what's the deal with this? And he was like, well, I was kind of busy, I probably went to go see like a Miami Heat game or whatever. I'm embellishing a little, but like you get the gist. And he was like, I might have used ChatGPT to generate some of this stuff for me. And he got
Might have.
fined like a few
Yeah.
$1,000s, I think. And so I'm curious if and it happens because of hallucinations, because there's always randomness, there's always probability that gets added into there. And I'm curious if you've ever come across in your discussions, people talking about, like, how do you prevent hallucinations? How do you detect hallucinations? It's not like it's a something bad. I mean, it's sort of part of the game. It's like in basketball, you might skin your knee every once in a while. Like that's just part of what happens. So I'm curious if there's any conversations that you've had around
Hmm.
hallucinations, or is it something that just kind of accept as par for the course?
Yeah, this is actually the single biggest topic that lawyers ask me
Hmm.
about when we talk about generative AI in legal work. And interestingly enough, one of the first lawyers I ever consulted with, he was in New York City, and he said he could have been that guy that was in the national press all over the place last summer for citing fake cases in court. He said he did the same thing. He looked in ChatGPT. It came up with stuff that seemed perfect for making the argument he wanted to make. He looked them up in LexisNexis. They didn't exist. Looked them up in Westlaw. Nope. And he was just kind of freaking out on the Zoom call with me saying, man, I came so close to being that guy. It's a big concern. The issue is that these generative AI systems are actually trained. They're programmed explicitly to come across authoritatively and confidently. And so if you don't understand what you're dealing with and you don't have a way to verify the answers, you can get screwed over pretty easily. So what I recommend lawyers do is typically the main risk in terms of hallucinations is when you're dealing with legal specific data. If you're doing general research just to understand the background of a situation, it's less critical that you get every single detail perfect. But if you're going to cite a case, you better find it in a reputable law library or law database. You need some kind of independent verification for that. So my recommendation is always take it with a grain of salt. Another thing that I do every time I teach lawyers about this is I always ask them to try a few prompts in ChatGPT in an area that they know cold, whether it's like a personal hobby or something in the profession, something where they have really, really deep specific knowledge, and just start asking questions. And in every case, they find that it comes back generally good, but with some just completely crappy answers that are just flat out wrong. And once you actually see that happen and you go, oh my gosh, I know way more than this thing on subject X, it kind of gives you a little bit of immunity to falling for bullshit that ChatGPT might throw at you in an area where you're not able to detect it.
Mhm. I could definitely do that for, making bread, at least.
There you go.
Curious of what it would say. So are the next generation of programmers, you kind of talked to it a little bit before, they're going to be able to use this tool. Like this is just going to be something that they grew up with, sort of like when my kids are growing up, YouTube is sort of the quintessential gig, that all of them want to be YouTube influencers. So it's part of their zeitgeist. It is what it is.
Yeah.
I'm curious in terms of the next generation of attorneys, do you see them having this as something that they're going to need to go through and, maybe a few of them are going to get burned from it? Or are they just going to it's just going to be so imbibed into their learning experience that there's going to be maybe when they're a classroom, they're like an L2 or an L3, like Chat GPT 101, like where do you see them kind of using this in the next generation?
Yeah, so that's already happening. I've had some conversations with a friend who teaches, he's a professor at a law school who teaches courses on legal tech and AI. And so this is actually something that's already being introduced at most law schools right now. There's actually, excuse me, there's actually not as much exposure in most law schools, as far as I understand, to generative AI as you might expect. It is a little bit of a slow uptake, but it is
Mhm.
happening. And I believe that within a few years, it will just be par for the course. It may not be considered as core a skill as the foundational legal skills themselves, but just like it's unconscionable to think of a practicing attorney today not understanding how to use Microsoft Word or email or something. I think that generative AI is going to slot into that foundational, like nearly invisible skill set that things like Microsoft Office occupy today. And yeah, we could get into some interesting implications of reliance on that as well. But um, the legal field is somewhat more reluctant than some others I've seen to embrace this. What I see is that nearly every lawyer is thinking about it. Very few lawyers are actively pursuing it, but those who are really finding tremendous benefits from it. It's almost like this secret that they can't wait to share with their colleagues, but it's still a fairly tiny minority of lawyers that are really jumping in with both feet into this.
Mhm. Yeah. mean, same thing with programmers too. I've definitely noticed my abilities have been able to slightly increase because I don't have to spend as much time Googling things. I can ask it to synthesize things. I can ask it to give me pros and cons of using one implementation over another. But it always rests, kind of like what you were saying, you want to ask ChatGPT something where you're just stone cold on the knowledge. It's always good to have a foundation upon which to build on because otherwise, if you don't have that scar tissue of knowing, hey, I needed to look in LexisNexis before I cited this case, you're going to get yourself into a fair amount of trouble. And maybe it's just something that the next generation, maybe they're just going to take it for granted. They're just going to have this as part of their DNA, so to speak, of, how what being an attorney in 2044 looks like now that we're sitting, in
Yeah.
2024.
Yeah, the fundamental thing though is actually a very old concept. If you're practicing law before ChatGPT, before Westlaw databases, all these things existed, you're still responsible for reading the briefs, reading the statutes, reading the holdings, what have you. And I've heard this, I've read this in books about law, I've heard this from many lawyers that one of the foundational ways of being burned as an attorney is not reading all the details of every document you're referring to in some kind of proceeding. And so this is just like a move that's been burning lawyers as long as they've existed. So now what we have here with this technology is just a newer and more exotic way to screw up. But the foundational problem is the same. Ultimately, you, whether you're a lawyer or a programmer, you're responsible for what you do. If you're a programmer copying and pasting in code that you don't fully understand, it's still ultimately on you. You're responsible for what you did. So my advice to people who are relying on this, whether you're an expert or especially more of a novice, is always make sure that you've done a personal level of verification, that you actually understand. And you can use the tool itself, like you said, to explain what's happening, explain the reasoning, explain the steps. Um, AI isn't as good at providing citations or reasoning as we'd like it to be, but it's getting better. There are really deep reasons for that in the way the models are trained, but it's getting better. But the burden ultimately rests on the person using the technology or the tool for what's actually done with it.
Absolutely. That is a textbook way to end one of these interviews. So if people want to learn more about you, learn more about your work, where can they go? Where do they go to find more Vern Eastley?
Yeah, two main places. So my website is verneastley.ai, and you can also look me up on LinkedIn. I write pretty frequently about AI topics, especially in legal. So look me up on LinkedIn and we can correspond there.
Most definitely. Well, it's been a pleasure, Vern. Always appreciate talking to you. And ladies and gentlemen, we'll catch you in the future.